Hi, how are you? It's me, the embodiment of your own mind given the form of a content creator on the social media platform of YouTube. I'm here today to bring you a silly video on a silly topic, that being the complete history of the L button. So, I've grabbed every single controller I could possibly find in my living receptacle, so let's get this show on the road. The SNES was the mother of all L buttons, being the first console ever to include these little shoulder nuggets we often take for granted these days. They were a revolutionary invention, yet unheard of in game controllers, allowing for a new degree of control one couldn't even imagine without them. Yeah, it was used in like 12 games, and only a handful of them actually have meaningful use cases, like Super Metroid, F-Zero, and aside from that you get to move the camera slightly to the left in Super Mario World. That's never useful, especially because the levels go to the right. Furthermore, these buttons feel weird to press. It's hard to describe how I feel about them because I don't hate it, it's just weird. It feels like it should go down more, but the button just stops. It doesn't really feel natural. I've decided I'm going to be ranking all these L buttons in a tier list and give a small review of them overall, and of course that's going to start with this controller. Overall, the SNES was a proof of concept for L buttons everywhere, and that really shows through in the design. After all, it's essentially a rounded rectangle on another vaguely rounded rectangle shape. It's not much to write home about, and its lack of functionality and weird feeling makes it not go any higher than a B tier for me. The next chronological L button is the Nintendo 64. And just like every other aspect of the 64 controller, this L button is actual trash. Not only is it a Sisyphean task to even get a handle on it, because of the absolute absurdity of this controller's design, it's not even really used all that much. I have yet to find a game in the 64 library that uses the L button in a meaningful way that isn't already filled by a different button, namely the R button or the Z button. Granted, that makes sense because trying to hold this controller is like trying to decide which version of Twilight to buy. Cause, well, you may have tons of options: Blu-ray, DVD, HD DVD, extended edition, widescreen. At the end of the day, all of them suck, so you may as well just burn it and use the ashes to conduct a satanic ritual, because it would be a better use of your time than this. So, sorry, Nintendo 64, but you're easily getting a D tier from me. Alright, now we're getting somewhere. Finally, after 2 consoles of mediocre L buttons, we come to the GameCube. Let me just say, there's a reason this controller is heralded as the holy grail of game controllers. This thing is beautiful. And that extends to its L button as well. The whole design just melts into my hand, and I always love an analog trigger. This is one of the best L buttons ever designed. It fits perfectly into the controller design and is perfect in use. The only real complaint is that, while I do love the analog design, the differences between the analog input and the fully pressed down input sometimes feels a little inconsistent, or difficult to press fully down at times. This is because there's a little bit of a stopper right in between the analog and fully pressed down. There's a reason competitive Melee players specifically cut the strings on their controllers, because using or not using analog inputs can literally mean the difference between life and death in that game. However, that does not discount the absolute perfection that is the GameCube L button. This is an easy S tier for me. Now up next we have the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Advance SP. The original Game Boy doesn't have an L button, so we're just skipping it for today. These L buttons are pitiful in every meaning of the word. First up, the design. Like, it's fine, I guess. Neither of them are particularly good, but I have to say I prefer the Game Boy Advance. With the SP, it always feels like my fingers are slipping off the button because of the tiny shape. I also prefer the higher clickiness of the SP. On the original GBA, pressing the button never feels like it actually does anything. There's not really any audible or visual feedback to show that the button has been pressed. It barely even goes down. Like, at least the size is pretty good, and it allows for a little bit of freedom, but even then you can pretty much only press the button from the outer edge, otherwise it just does not work. Yeah, sorry Game Boys, but you guys are both getting D tier. So I'm purposely going off chronological order here, because I don't have an original PS1 or PS2 controller, and to be honest, I no longer care about the order these L buttons go in. In the interest of annoying as many people as possible, I am now going to be covering the first controller in this video with multiple L buttons. The Xbox One controller, or something, whatever this controller is, I don't care. Some may consider these particular buttons to not be L buttons because they're technically LB and LT, the left bumper and trigger respectively, but me personally, I see L as a variable, and the B and T are a multiplied variable on top of the L variable, so I think it counts. I have mixed feelings on these particular L buttons. I really like the trigger because, once again, it's an analog input, and it has a point up on the GameCube because there's not a stopper, making the usage of this button much easier and smoother. However, looking at the bumper, it starts to go down really quickly. This little nugget of a button doesn't feel satisfying to press, and it often feels like I'm not doing anything when I press it. Seems like the game developers agree because this button has hardly ever used, especially when the trigger is right there. That's really the only saving grace it has, but if my present to you was not buying you Spider-Man 3, on HD, DVD, 3D, and widescreen, you would probably be a little bit upset. So, for as good as the left trigger is, due to the drawbacks of the bumper, I cannot put this L button any higher than A tier, unfortunately. Now for something completely different. The PlayStation 3 is what I long considered to be the best controller, until my hands got too big, and the PlayStation 4 controller showed it up in practically every way. And looking back, these L buttons are not very good. The PlayStation 3 was released in the era in which it was more common for shooter games to use the left bumper, in this case the L1 button, to aim. And let me tell you, that does not feel good with this particular button. It feels too small and specific to press. It feels like no matter which way I hold my hand, it's always in an uncomfortable position, which is also a bit of an accessibility issue because it really starts to hurt my fingers and wrist after a while of holding it down, which in the context of shooter games, you're going to be doing quite a lot. The left trigger, or L2, is much the same, but with the added caveat of not being used as frequently, especially in terms of holding it down. But even the act of merely pressing it down feels awful. The resistance feels too high for what it is, something that can really get in the way of specific analog inputs, and it always feels like you have to use too much force to keep it held down, which also causes hand and wrist pain, at least for me. This one isn't as egregious as the 64 controller, so I guess I'll give it a C tier, but I'm not happy about it. I mentioned this briefly in the last segment, but the PS4 controller is essentially the better PS3 controller in every way, and that applies to the L buttons as well. Not only are they larger and easier to press, they also actually fit into the controller's design and melt into my hands really, really well. This console was when shooter games started more commonly using L2, the trigger, for aiming instead of L1, which definitely helps out quite a bit because L2 is much easier and better to hold down for long periods of time instead of L1. These buttons are so much better and easier to press than the PS3. It's such an improvement that I think I have to give this controller an S tier. Alright, what do I have left to cover? Most of these are Nintendo controllers, so I may as well wrap up the other controllers before finishing our catalog of L buttons. The Xbox 360 controller, the predecessor of the other Xbox controller I covered, probably. I don't know, I don't follow Xboxes. And guess what? It's just the same as the other Xbox controller, but slightly worse. C tier. Next, the Nintendo Wii Classic controller is one of the controllers at all time, and that is not thanks to the L buttons. Despite having both an L and a ZL button, they both act like bumpers, neither of them are analog, and they both feel like trash to press. It comes back to the problem of, there's no feedback when you press the button, only it's somehow even worse than the Game Boy. Also, this may not be a problem for everyone, but the ZL buttons stick out weirdly far back. It feels like there's no comfortable way for my hands to rest while holding this thing. It never feels natural. And that only gets amplified when I need to press one of these buttons, so I'll have to give this controller a B tier. The Wii U gamepad! This console has been much maligned, and to be honest, I love the Wii U. That's due in large part to the gamepad. I think it's a fantastic controller for an alright console. The whole thing melts completely into my hands, it's so comfortable, I don't even have to think about it. And the L buttons, in this case, once again L and ZL, are also amazing. They're large enough to be comfortable to press without overpowering anything. And the controller is comfortable enough to hold that for once it feels natural to have my fingers on both L buttons at once, a trait not shown in any other controller with multiple L buttons. This controller is an easy S tier, almost as easy as the GameCube. These L buttons are phenomenal. The new 3DS, also known as the Wii U Lite, is essentially the same as the Game Boy Advance from earlier combined with the SP model. This version of the 3DS has two L buttons, once again L and ZL. The L button is much like an improved version of the L button from the GBA, and the ZL button is exactly like the L button from the SP. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's uncomfortable to press. There's practically no feedback for pressing the button. It has practically no functionality that other buttons on the 3DS don't have. This gets a D tier. These buttons aren't terrible, but the L button is a bit too small for my liking. While both buttons are rather comfortable to press, I just don't get the same excitement from pressing them as I do with, say, the Wii U. It's fine, they're both fine, I just simply don't care about this particular L button. Here's where I would say it's in D tier, but we actually have another button to go over. The ZL button. Let me tell you, this is the best ZL button we have gone over so far. It's big enough to where it's comfortable to press, and while it isn't analog, it still feels wonderful to press and gives fantastic feedback. So, with the savior that is the ZL button, this controller moves up to A tier. This controller sucks. If the Joy-Con was a murder weapon, it would be the 2-inch rusty paring blade that's been dulled by years of trying to use it as a hex screwdriver to put together a home-built deck made with mahogany, while also being used as a saw to cut said wood. By the time investigators and EMTs got to the scene, they would be confused and concerned as to how someone was murdered by it, and the grisly scene would emphasize the fact that there was more damage done to the murderer than the victim, and the victim's dead. If the Joy-Con was a bar, it would be a seedy back alley bar that can only be accessed through a labyrinth of side roads and one detour through the sewer that sells water, root beer, and straight absinthe because they can't afford anything else. If the Joy-Con was a Metallica album, it would be Saint Anger. If the Joy-Con was a person, it would be a 19-year-old frat boy freshman in college that goes by Chad to hide the fact that his name is Charles, gets straight D's in everything, but he eventually graduates because his parents are financially supporting the school, and he's a quarterback for the university football team, the Demons. His jersey number is 16 because he wants to order his favorite quarterback, Ryan Leaf, from the Dallas Cowboys. I remembered about halfway through that paragraph that I'm supposed to be reviewing the L buttons on this thing, but I don't know, there's not much to say. It's a glorified textured soap bar with the scent of cheap rubber and joystick drift. I feel like if I used this thing wrong, I would swallow it.
Whoops.
But alright. Everyone deserves the right to a fair trial, even if you're the Joy-Con. This is a bit of a special case because it actually technically has 3 L buttons. You have your traditional L and ZL combination we've seen before on Nintendo controllers, but then you also have this third one, a weird little nugget called the SL button. And they suck. They're way too small to be comfortable to use, and there is less than 0 feedback when you press the button. Pressing the SL button feels like I'm trying to surgically remove a single skin cell from my own eyelid. It never seems like I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and half the time, I'm nowhere near anything I'm actually supposed to be pushing. This gets F tier. F for Ferdinand von Ayer.